on your end.
Yes, all set. We're recording.
Perfect. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started into the presentation, just to welcome everybody again to Breakout Room C on contracting with federal agencies. Thank you for joining our FRAC lunch discussion today. We have with us my very wonderful colleague, Jeff Warner, who is currently the director of the Contracts Office in the Office of Research at the University of Central Florida, which is responsible for the negotiation and execution of funded and unfunded agreements associated with sponsored projects. He previously served as Director of Ancillary Research Agreements at the University of California, San Diego, where he managed a team of contracts officers responsible for a variety of contract service lines, including unfunded and service agreements. Very, very excited for this discussion today with you all about contracting in federal agencies. My name is Rebecca Hannis. I am the Assistant Director in the Contracts Office, also at the University of Central Florida. I'll be serving as your room monitor. This is going to be an informal, interactive discussion, so your participation is welcomed and encouraged. Please feel free to post any questions or any comments that you may have in the chat, which I will be monitoring throughout the session so that I can share those as we go forward. And with that, Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Becca. I want to echo Becca's comments about this being an interactive discussion. I think with federal contracting, leveraging your peers' knowledge and those subject matter experts on your campus is critical. Federal contracting is something that can be much easier if you're leveraging the experience and knowledge of those that have worked in federal contracting for a long time. So as Becca mentioned, the goal of the luncheon, it's an informal introductory discussion about federal contracts. The University of Central Florida is unique in the sense that a large portion of its federal funding comes in the form of federal contracts. Typically the funding structure for a university is most of the funding comes through federal financial assistance awards. We work through contracts, both direct and indirect, from federal agencies regularly. And we all collaborate together within the contracts office and with our compliance partners across campus to efficiently and appropriately negotiate those contracts. So again, please feel free to respond in the chat or unmute. Again, we've got a pretty large group here, but I think the last few discussion groups have been pretty engaging, so feel free to chime in. Going into the first sort of overall structure of federal funding, there's really sort of four main categories of agreements that you can receive for federal funding. You have a grant, which is your most typical federal financial assistance awards, where the institute conducting the research is pretty much just receiving the funding, and there really isn't any substantial programmatic involvement from the sponsor. You have a cooperative agreement, which is also federal financial assistance. However, there is programmatic involvement from the sponsor. So they're going to be working with the investigator. There's collaboration. It's really how it's named, it's cooperative. Then you have a contract, which is used when the principal purpose of the agreement is to provide tangible results or a deliverable of items to carry out a prescribed service for the direct benefit or use of the funding agency. So payment is contingent upon performance. So there's a deliverable. It's much more applied. It could be that it's for a particular service or a particular deliverable, but really payment is based upon that successful completion of the project. There's also sort of this other type of contract called an other transaction agreement, which is not subject to any of the administrative requirements of grants, and they're not subject to the federal regulations governing procurement. So that's kind of a miscellaneous category in my experience. But today we're going to focus our attention on federal contracts. So in looking at the different funding mechanisms for working with federal agencies, how does your institution assign these different funding mechanisms? Are they broken out? Does your institution have grants and cooperative agreements going to one group on your campus in the central office and federal contracts going to another? Feel free to respond in the chat. Here at the University of Central Florida, we do break them out in that way. So contracts that are negotiable, such as a federal contract, is going to be handled by the contracting office, whereas a grant or a non-negotiable cooperative agreement is going to go through our award management team. Federal contracts require expertise with the FAR, and a contract negotiation, similar to a negotiation with industry. So I see some responses in the chat here.
We do. We have a couple comments in the chat from folks who handle everything in one area in their main office.
So there's some advantages and disadvantages to each of the models. So one of the advantages, with one unit handling them all, is that overall you're still working with the federal government. You're getting, with federal financial assistance awards, you become familiar with uniform guidance. With contracts, you become familiar with FAR. However, there's a lot of overlap in, vocabulary, processes, compliance concerns. So you develop an expertise overall, professional development as well. You're working both with grants and contracts. But when you have a breakout, you're able to develop more expertise with contracts. And as I mentioned when we started, because of how nuanced federal contracting can be, the hundreds, if not thousands of FAR clauses there are out there, really that direct experience will help push those federal contract negotiations along much quicker. I've also seen it at some institutions where there's actually specialized teams. So here at the University of Central Florida, we have contracts officers who negotiate contracts with federal and non-federal entities. There is an assignment based on sponsor type or a department-based assignment model. However, I have seen at other institutions assignments based on sponsors. So they'll have a specialized team that solely negotiates federal contracts. And those individuals are very experienced and highly knowledgeable when it comes to federal acquisition regulations. So we looked at each of the areas in terms of types of agreements that you could receive from the federal government.
We've got some more comments in the chat. Some definitely some other institutions all handling things in the central office. It sounds like Texas A&M handles things similarly to how we do here at UCF. And then we also have a question from someone who's pretty new to contracts and would like if you could speak to some of the things to look out for.
Absolutely. So with federal contracts, the federal acquisition regulation is going to be the primary regulation used by all agencies in their acquisitions of supplies and services with appropriated funds. The FAR, as it's referred to, contains standard solicitation provisions and contract clauses and various agency FAR supplements. So you have the FAR, but then you also have agency-specific supplements, such as the EFAR, NASA's FAR, and these agency-specific supplements have their own list of clauses. So when you're negotiating a contract, you're going to encounter these FAR clauses either incorporated in full text, where you have the entire FAR clause included in the contract, or you could actually include just a list of FAR clauses that are incorporated into the contract by reference, or both. So it just sort of depends on the structure of the contract is how you're going to see these FAR clauses incorporated. When you are reviewing the contract and you have FAR clauses just listed there, you're going to have to do some due diligence on your part and pull up that FAR clause. So one of the easiest ways is just to type it into Google. Another way, and I think one of the more efficient ways, is for your institution to maintain a FAR review tool. So, for institutions that have a high volume of federal contracts, we all want to make it as easy for the contracts officers as possible. We don't want to reinvent the wheel each time. We don't want every contracts officer to, thank you, I see a reference to a matrix at Penn State. Penn State is great about sharing their matrix online. In my career, I've referenced it many times. It's, again, so helpful to leverage the resources and knowledge of peers. As much as people can share information in their position on certain FAR clauses, why should each institution have to go back through and review it themselves, multiple times over and over again? what you're trying to do is avoid that, duplicative effort. If you understand whether or not your institution can accept a FAR clause, or you understand what sort of steps need to be taken to accept a FAR clause, let's memorialize that in a matrix so that contracts officers can reference that in the future and quickly go through a contract and not have to pull up each one, look at the language, understand whether or not it's applicable. It takes a lot of time. So if you can automate that more by utilizing tools, it plays in your contracts officer's benefit. Obviously, the FAR is revised regularly to incorporate new laws or executive orders. One stands out that was, the FAR was recently modified to include a new clause for an executive order, and that executive order is 14042, the federal contractor vaccine requirements. They implemented a FAR clause and a DFAR clause to incorporate that executive order. So we can develop these tools and these resources, but they need to be maintained regularly to make sure that if there's a change in your institutional policy, changes in your guidelines, or there are new FAR clauses added, we're paying attention to it, and we're looking out to see, sort of what modifications we need to make to that tool or those resources that you have available. So getting into questions, and we're going to go more into some of the key issues to look out for here shortly. But before I move on from resources, I know that there was someone in the chat that mentioned the Penn State matrix. Are there any other types of tools that your institutions utilize? Is there anything automated, such as a online platform where you can search for a particular FAR clause? I know in my experience, the University of California system has an online tool where you just copy and paste the FAR clause into the platform, and it comes back with the FAR clause and the prescription and some institutional information about what needs to be done with that FAR clause. So it looks like a matrix is probably the most popular. It is a really easy format to digest as a contracts officer when you're able to just go quickly from FAR tab to DFAR tab and going through each of the supplements. So it looks like that appears to be most popular. So if your institution has a FAR resource like a matrix or an online platform, is there a designated group within the central office or on your campus that's responsible for updating that resource? We talked about new FAR clauses, changes in policies. Do you have a specific owner of that tool that's responsible for it?
It looks like we have one comment that says, yes, we have a small group of owners at FSU. Also going back to the previous discussion of different tools, there's another comment again in using Penn State's matrix and also acquisition.gov.
Yes, definitely. Acquisition.gov. There are online resources pulling up those FAR clauses online and some background information about languages. I know that there's a few blogs out there too where you can stay up to date on any sort of new FAR clauses that are coming up. So, not only just, looking at the Federal Register, which we all know is a challenging thing to digest on a regular basis, but there's other tools to keep other informational websites that you can stay abreast of the latest changes to the FAR. And if you're maintaining a FAR matrix, that's a helpful thing to do, so when to update it or when to incorporate a new tool. But I like FSU's approach of having a designated group on campus that is owning that tool, because it is something that, as we all get busy with our transactions and actually negotiating these federal contracts, updating the clause is really updating the tool is challenging. It's hard to make time for it, but if you have an assigned group that owns it and meets regularly, that would be great. For those groups that meet regularly, how often are you looking at the tool? Is it as policies change, or is it as new FAR clauses come out, or is it simply like a regular quarterly review of the tool and an update?
We've got a few more comments and questions in the chat. Leanne comments that she's the one who, when UNF has new FAR clauses, is not on their matrix, will update them when needed. David has offered that Texas A&M Research Service contract negotiation. And Kelly has commented that the lack of dedicated centralized updates is why it's not useful, because it's not up to date at her institution. Going into your point, Jeff, about the need to monitor and maintain updates. Lisa also has asked a question: would the institutes that have these FAR tools, matrices, etc., be willing to share the links with everyone? I know that Penn State's is made available for everyone's general use very kindly, but I'm not sure of the others, Jeff, if you wanted to address that, or if anybody else in the discussion that has offered that they have one would be willing to share.
Sharing this knowledge and sharing these resources is important. I think, in my experience, the only hesitation that institutions have is, to make it very clear that this is just for informational purposes. In no way should this be considered legal advice from one institution to another. I know Penn State has a disclaimer at the top of their matrix that puts you on notice about that. It's something that is institution specific. One institution could move forward with a particular FAR clause, while one could not, just depending on the institution itself, what policies they have in place, what controls they have in place. In my mind, I'm thinking of cybersecurity. Some of these, data specific, some of the cybersecurity specific type clauses. If your institution doesn't have the appropriate controls in place, you may not be able to accept such a clause. However, an institution such as the University of Central Florida that does have this comprehensive IT group that does provide RPIs the ability to work in these protected areas, we do have the ability to move forward with it. So it just sort of depends. And while you can take a resource from another institution, it would need to be adapted for your own policies and risk, how comfortable your institution is with risk.
It looks like we've got a couple links that have been offered in the chat. Back to your question, Lisa, and for anybody else who's interested, that Leanne has offered a link to their tool, and Jane has posted a link to the Penn State FAR matrix.
Great.
Just a reminder, these sessions are all recorded. So if you want to go back and be able to look at these links later, they will be made available after the conference.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that when the recording is shared with the FRAC administrative support, that the chat will also be shared, so those links are available as well. So going back to the question about key issues to look out for. So we talked about the federal acquisition regulations being those terms that you see within a federal contract, those clauses. Now, I'm not saying that it's only FAR clauses in a federal contract, but those are primarily where you're going to focus your attention when you're negotiating a contract. So key issues to look out for when you're reviewing those FAR clauses: publication restrictions, title to equipment, work for hire language. So what sort of intellectual property provisions in there? Are they looking at this as a service where the university is acting as a pair of hands and they're including work for hire language? What is your university's position on work for hire language? Is it appropriate? Is it something you can accept in certain instances? Or are you really going to push back and look towards the traditional research intellectual property language in the contract? There's also instances where broad indemnification can be included in a FAR clause, specifically those for commercial items. Does your institution have the ability to indemnify the federal government in such instances? Drug-free workforce versus drug-free workplace. Does your institution have a policy that you're drug testing your employees? Or is it simply a drug-free workplace? In my experience, a lot of institutions of higher education are a drug-free workplace. So you'd have to be careful to understand what sort of FAR clauses included there. Are there any other major key issues that you're looking out for when you're negotiating these federal contracts? Yes. Sorry.
In the chat, you're fine, Jeff. Went on restrictions on sea drills, also another data ownership.
Yep, absolutely. Sea drills, making sure you're understanding the distribution requirements for that contract. Data ownership. We're all looking to protect the academic freedom academic freedom of our investigators. And so we want to make sure we understand data ownership, what sort of markings there are for restricted data. Are we going to be receiving data on our side that is restricted? What sort of security requirements? I do have some talking points here below and questions about developing a partnership with your compliance group on campus and going through some of the cybersecurity and export control related FAR clauses. But I actually see a great question here. How do you divide work when it is federal flow through from an industry or for-profit sponsor? It's a great question, actually leads right to the next topic I wanted to discuss. So when we're working with a federal agency directly, it's a bit easier because we're negotiating the contract with the sponsor. We're able to communicate to them the why behind certain issues, what we're trying to do, what we can and can't accept, what's appropriate given the scope of work, what is appropriate given our status of it as an institution of higher education. And so it's a little bit easier to negotiate those federal contracts. However, when it's federal flow through, when you're working through an industry partner, it's going to be more challenging. And so what I'd like to discuss here is sort of communicating and negotiating with a contracts officer directly, but also with a counterpart at a pass-through entity. How are we approaching that communication? How are we approaching that negotiation? What are some strategies that we've all used that have been successful? In my experience, so with a contracting officer, as I mentioned, the why. Why can't we do something? Why something needs to be removed or an alternative FAR clause needs to be included. That's an important communication strategy. When I'm working with a pass-through entity, I'm communicating the why, but I'm also including in parallel communication that just because they accepted a FAR clause or just because they accepted a certain provision doesn't necessarily mean that we have to accept it. There is an opportunity for them to go back to their contracting officer and seek clarification that something does not need to be flowed down, or that an alternative FAR clause can be utilized in place of a FAR clause that they accepted. By them including it, by them accepting it, doesn't mean that the university needs to accept it or needs to include it in their contract. I think this is something that we can say across the board, whether it's indirect or directly from a federal agency. A contract is always open to negotiation. It's not the same as a grant. It's not the same as a non-negotiable cooperative agreement. A federal contract is negotiable. In my experience, some of these federal contracts, they throw everything in the kitchen sink, whether it is applicable or not. And they're relying on the institution to go through those provisions, to go through those FAR clauses and verify whether or not something is applicable, whether something is appropriate for an institution of higher education, whether something is even a factor for a particular scope of work. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a FAR clause in a contract that is so, out of left field, not even close to being appropriate for a particular project or the institution that I'm working at. And I have to push back. In my experience working with pass-through entities, some of these defense contractors, out there, or some of these other companies that work with the federal government all the time, they're going to send me, 15 pages of FAR clauses and say, please go through these and let us know what you can and can't accept. They're relying on us as contracting officers to go through those and assess whether a FAR clause or whether a provision is appropriate or something that the university can accept. So going back to a previous topic about resources, that's where these resources are important. If you're given 15 pages of FAR clauses and expected to go through them quickly and negotiate that contract, how can you do that efficiently? You're not going to be able to do so if you pull up each FAR provision individually. You're going to need to be able to go through that quickly. Really highlight the benefit of developing those resources for your contracts officers. Looks like we have a couple of questions, Becca.
We do. We've got another question or comment actually in the chat. One way we have done FAR removal, if they refuse to remove, is to add language that the FAR is incorporated for reference as it was included in the prime contract, but is only enforceable as applicable to an agency of the state of Texas, institution of higher education, per the prescription clause and the statement of work.
That's great advice. And, in certain instances, you're going to need to get creative and need to find a way to move forward with a contract where a FAR clause may not be appropriate or applicable, but the pass-through entity is unwilling to completely remove it. So language like this is a way to move forward, where you're not in a preferred position, but you're having to think creatively and protect the university against risk, but still not hold up the research. So I think this is a great recommended language here. And looking back at sort of communication and negotiation strategies, and knowing that federal contracts are negotiable, communicating to the contracts officer the why, documenting, what is the reason for this change? What is the reason why we can't accept something? Explaining to the pass-through entity that there is ways for them to alter the provisions of the contract that they flow down, contract terms they flow down to us. What are some other communication or negotiation strategies that you found successful as a contracting officer or works well for your institution? So in my experience, communicating the why, as I mentioned, is important, but also how you're communicating it. Are you doing it solely via email, electronic communication, where you're going back and forth and redlining FAR clauses or provisions and including rationale? Or are you reaching out to the contracting officer and setting up a call? I prefer verbal negotiations. I think you're able to get through a contract much quicker, especially if you're conceptually so far apart on an issue. Setting the first red line via email with your rationale, having the response come back, and then utilizing that opportunity to have a conversation with the contracting officer. Exactly, Alexa, jumping on the phone. However, there are certain instances that I've run into where the contracting officer is uncomfortable, working through that negotiation over the phone. Sometimes on the federal agency side, there's multiple reviews, multiple groups that need to provide feedback. So it may not just be one person who can actually go through the contract and have the authority to accept changes or provide rationales why something can't be removed. So what I've done is really push to have a collaborative conversation. Feel free to include anyone on your side that needs to be a part of the discussion. If you need anyone from my side, such as an export control officer, someone on the cybersecurity, the principal investigator, I'm happy to include them in the conversation, making them feel comfortable that it can be a large group. It doesn't have to be one-on-one. That we do need to tap into subject matter experts at each of our, at the agency, at the institution. And it tends to work pretty well for me. And I'm telling you, it is much more efficient if you have that conversation with the contracting officer, if you truly are so far apart in the terms and conditions.
We've got a couple new comments in the chat. Sabrina agrees on communicating the why, highly recommends calls and Zoom. She says, I also ask if they would make something mutual. To be fair, if they won't do it, it helps to justify getting it out, but would have to be okay for it to be mutual. Ask for justifications. And Kelly also comments, depending on the issues, I sometimes involve my PI to educate my PI on the issues, to ask my researcher to reach out to his technical counterpart to educate that person on why the issue is an issue for us at the university.
That's great advice, Kelly. Leveraging your principal investigator and their relationship with their program officer is a helpful tactic. I typically wait until sort of that impasse to bring in the principal investigator. If I'm truly at a position where I don't know how we're going to move forward, there's a really problematic term included in the contract, and the contracting officer is unwilling to remove it. I'm going to reach out to the PI and see if there's anything they can do on their side. Or if something is based on the scope of work, if I'm arguing for removal or a change of a clause based on the scope of work, it may be helpful to have that technical knowledge as part of the conversation for them to be able to explain it. And for the contracting officer to have their technical point of contact on the phone call as well, because they may not understand sort of where the difference is. So leveraging as many partners that you can have at your institution is going to make it a much easier negotiation for you. Right. So looking at developing partnerships with compliance colleagues across your university. a lot of the negotiation for a federal contract may focus on some of these issues associated with export control or cybersecurity. And at the University of Central Florida, we are very lucky in the sense that we have strong partnerships with our cybersecurity group and our export control group. And we have clear processes in place that allow us to reach out to them effectively. We utilize an electronic research administration system that has what we refer to as an ancillary review function. That function allows us to send a contract review request in the system to a particular compliance partner. We can provide some background, some information on what we want them to look at, attach a copy of the contract. There's also some template forms that we've developed with export control that allow us to point out red flags that we've identified in the contract. We've also developed a clear process with our cybersecurity group where we identify certain indicators that warrant a cybersecurity review. So when we're looking at cybersecurity and we're looking at the particular FAR clauses, we're looking at basic CMMC, cybersecurity requirements, covered contractor information systems, things that prohibit us utilizing certain software. Kaspersky Lab, we all know that 52.204-23, there's certain requirements of the institution not to utilize software and services developed by a certain entity. There's other ones out there as well. NIST requirements. Let's see here, safeguarding the 7012 clause, which is covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. So these FAR clauses and DFAR clauses that we have identified with our cybersecurity group as indicators that warrant their review, it's helpful for our officers to have those listed out as a resource. So when they're reviewing a contract and they know, these 10 different clauses are indicators that cybersecurity is required, it's easy for them to have to send it over to their partners in cybersecurity. And really it builds their confidence and understanding that they're going to be catching all of these compliance issues because they have this information readily available to them. The cybersecurity group here on campus and export control, there's obviously overlap in those two areas. They have a strong working relationship with each other, and they're strong allies for us. They'll actually jump on a phone call with us with the federal agency. They'll participate in the negotiation. I know that's not the case for every institution. I know that in at some institutions, at least in my experience, those compliance partners act as consultants. They're not actually engaging in the negotiation. But I can tell you from my experience here at UCF, having them participate in the discussion can really help with negotiations. They understand these FAR clauses. They understand these requirements because they're on the back end helping the principal investigator comply when we move forward with them. So having them as part of the conversation, having them engage with the principal investigator, I can't tell you how much that's going to play into having a positive experience on negotiating these contracts. What we've done to develop these partnerships is have early buy-in, talk through these issues with them, understand where their concerns are, what are priorities for the institution, and then we work together and we develop guidance. We work together so that we have resources. We understand what information they need from us, especially with these federal contracts. What is helpful for them? Sending them over a 50-page federal contract with 100 FAR clauses is not so helpful for them. Being able to point them in the right direction and identify what are the indicators or red flags makes their review much easier. So I recommend, when you're working through, developing a process or resources for a federal negotiation, you're reaching out to these compliance partners. And I've been speaking primarily about export control and cybersecurity, but we all know there's other areas on campus that we would need to reach out to: risk management, potentially general counsel. I'm trying to think of other areas that may be involved. Obviously, IRB and IACUC, just depending on the type of issue that you're running into. But with federal contracts especially, it's important for them to feel like a part of the process. It's easy for us when we're negotiating these contracts because you're going through so many of these FAR clauses to overlook something and put the university at risk. But if they know that you have these controls in place, these resources available, it will, I think, strengthen your relationship with them. Now, I've spoken about the University of Central Florida's process and partnerships that we've developed. What sort of processes does your institution have in place to ensure these compliance areas in federal contracts are addressed, or that you're getting the contract over to the appropriate group on your campus? Do you have something similar like the University of Central Florida, where we have, sort of these ancillary review type functionality in our ERA system?
Oh, it looks like Russ says we use ancillary reviews as well.
Well, that's great. Great.
And this is Sabrina I'm technically with Texas A&M AgriLife Research here under the A&M University system. We have a kind of a proprietary system that's called Maestro. It's where we route all of our internal documentation. One of the things that we've added, in addition to where faculty indicate, compliance issues, there is a specific portion of that that is dedicated to administrative review for publication requirements, NISCOM, FSMA, NIST, and a few other things to ensure that those are addressed and either marked yes or no for every single contract. And that would automatically send a notification to the corresponding compliance representative or office.
Okay. And Sabrina, in your work with those compliance partners, are they also engaging in the negotiation with you, or are they just providing their feedback as part of their review process?
For the most part, it would be the latter.
Okay.
But there are times where if it's really not going to be applicable to the project and there's difficulty in the negotiations, actually getting them out, then they will get engaged in contract negotiations. But for the most part, they don't need to. But I handle specifically industry sponsored projects and federal flow through industry. So one of the questions that I had earlier was, when you're dividing workload, are federal flow throughs really considered more federal, or are they really considered industry with federal terms and conditions? I was just curious how other institutions had addressed that.
Here at UCF, we have them assigned to the same officers. They are some of the most challenging, though, I'm sure, as you understand, because you're negotiating the terms and conditions that the company puts on top of the federal contract that they've already negotiated and already accepted and look at as non-negotiable. There's a lot of there's a lack of understanding at the commercial partner in sort of how the university works with federal agencies, what sort of conditions they can comply with. So they think that just because they've been able to move forward with something, the university will be able to do that too. And then on top of that, they're trying to, maybe overstep some of those terms like intellectual property, where, they're sort of going above and beyond what they've been obligated to do as part of their federal contract so that they have access to that intellectual property, being very careful to ensure that you are sort of complying with those federal regulations as they relate to intellectual property and not overcommitting to the sponsor in the sort of attached subcontract documents, those flow through terms.
Yep, we see the same thing. They are usually it's IP, confidentiality, and publications.
Absolutely. Publications, certainly. Thank you so much for participating. The publications are, sort of publication rights is always a sensitive topic with some of these federal contracts, especially those that are subcontracts. Understanding when we get into these restricted data FAR clauses, what we can and can't do, and what sort of communication needs to be made to the PI, ensuring that they're on board. With federal contracts, having informed participation by the principal investigator and researchers is also an important factor. We utilize a request for clarification function in our electronic research administration system that allows us to reach out to the principal investigator in our system and document their understanding of certain terms and conditions. And we use this with federal contracts as well, when there's something that's included that will impact their performance of the scope of work, or what they can or can't do with the results coming from that scope of work. So partnerships, not just with compliance groups, but also with your department research administrators and PIs, is going to be another factor that plays into the success of your negotiation of a federal contract. So we initially skipped over this topic of the conversation when we went down to federal acquisition regulation clauses, but there's also the payment structure of the federal contract to consider when you're reviewing the contract. The most common type of payment structure at an institution or a university, probably the cost reimbursable contract, where the federal agency pays for the full cost of the scope of work up into an agreed upon amount. So they're reimbursing the university for those costs incurred to complete the scope of work. There's also, the fixed price contract where there's a predetermined amount that we agree to, and that's what they're going to pay us without consideration of reimbursing actual expenditures. There's also indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, sort of quasi-type master agreement when the quantity of goods or services are needed but not known or specified within the contract. The sponsor issues task orders for the delivery or the performance of the project during the life of the contract. So they're issuing you task orders under that contract. There's also time and materials. So this allows a sponsor to acquire supplies or services based on specific labor hours and actual material costs. So question to this group, what is the preferred structure for your federal contracts? Is your preference cost reimbursable, fixed price? Typically those are the two most popular at universities.
We've got a previous comment also from Alexa in the chat, noting that she, at her institution, uses something similar, an award review and approval form, where the PIs and deans sign off on the T's and C's, and then we point out the specific terms we want them to note.
Great.
We've also got another comment from Kelly that the risk is lowest with cost reimbursable, and I tried to add that in our proposals for federal contracts.
Absolutely. Cost reimbursable is definitely the lowest risk. Cost reimbursable obviously will be reimbursed for the costs that we incur for completing the scope of work up until an agreed upon amount. With a fixed price, you could overrun on those costs, and the federal government is only obligated to pay you that amount. So you could potentially go into the deficit. So if your institution does allow for a fixed price contract, are there any sort of additional steps to secure departmental, college, school, or PI understanding or acceptance of that fixed price payment structure?
Again, continuing with the discussion of the types of payment structure, Sabrina indicated that most of their federal are cost reimbursable, for-profit are mixed, but recommended as cost reimbursable. And Lisa also comments cost reimbursable.
Great. Well, in my experience working with a fixed price contract, I want to make sure that the department, the school, the college, and the PI all understand what a fixed price contract entails. Typically, as mentioned in the chat here, this discussion can occur at the proposal stage. You're discussing this as part of your proposal process, how you're budgeting it, what you're proposing, what you're including in the proposal. And so, you're going to have that earlier on in the process, but it's something I also do at the contracting stage, making sure that at least I'm going back to the proposal record and verifying that there was an understanding documented. And if I'm unable to find that, and I'm not speaking about my experience here at UCF, but at previous institutions, I'm going to follow up with the department PI to confirm. I don't see a clear understanding of what's being signed on for. I want to make sure that that's documented so that there's any question during the performance of the contract, or there's an opportunity for the project to run into a deficit. I have it clearly documented that it was understood from the very beginning, because it is much higher risk to agree to a fixed price contract than a cost reimbursable. Cost reimbursable is my preference. Low risk. We're not going to run into a deficit, so it really does protect the university. Now, we've talked primarily about cost reimbursable and fixed price, but there's also this fourth type of contract, which is time and materials. And time and materials is unique, and most universities are unable to accept time and material contracts because their infrastructure doesn't allow for it. We document, these sort of things based on effort. We're not tracking hours. And so really you need to have the infrastructure in place at your institution to accept such a contract. So are there any institutions on this call that can accept a time and materials contract? If so, what sort of additional systems have you put in place? Is it specific to a particular area on campus? What sort of best practices have you developed if you're able to accept a time and materials contract? So in my career, it's been very rare that I've been able to accept a time and materials contract. In most cases, it needs to be either fixed price, exactly, very rare. It needs to be fixed price or cost reimbursable. And if this comes up during the proposal process, and it's something that is non-negotiable issue for the other party, the question is, does the department who's going to be managing that contract have the ability to do so? If not, is there a way for them to procure, a third-party system that would allow them to do that? Is there any sort of support that they can receive institutionally to allow them to do that? In certain instances where time and materials contracts could be expected for a particular area of campus, they may go out and invest. And then, notify the proposal and contracts office and let them know this is not an issue for us. This is something that we can now do easily. So it just sort of depends and requires conversations. But, agreeing to a time and materials contract without having those conversations first is really something where you can find your institution in trouble, because you may not be able to provide the necessary information, may not be able to charge the contract appropriately.
Got several comments in the chat, mostly noting that the time and materials contracts would be very rare. Kelly points out that it would need very high executive level approval. And there are comments also from Elizabeth and Jessica in our contracts office here at UCF, noting that we do have a couple of specific departments that have systems in place to be able to handle those kinds of time and material contracts.
I have one situation that stands out in my career that concerns a time and materials contract at previous institutions, a couple institutions ago, where a department, signed on to do a time and materials contract. It was sort of documented that they understood what they were supposed to do, understood what sort of infrastructure they needed to put in place, approved by their senior leadership in the department. And once it came to performing the activities under the contract and invoicing and tracking those labor hours, they weren't able to fulfill their obligations. They weren't able to manage it. And they came back to the contracts office and requested that we find a way to renegotiate the contract to be a different payment structure. And it was, for lack of a better way to describe it, a nightmare. It was very challenging for us to overcome. It was something that was agreed to from the beginning and required very high level conversations. It was a high dollar value contract. And, it was really important for the institution to continue. The agency was interested in pursuing the scope of work. It just took a lot of time and effort to renegotiate those terms so that we could comply. So again, especially with these payment structures, understanding from the very beginning proposal stage, reaffirming at the contract stage, making sure everyone is understanding what they're obligated to do will be important for the success of that contract after execution. And I'm going to repeat this again. We're coming up on time here at the end of this discussion, but in my career, partnering with colleagues that have expertise negotiating federal contracts has been the best training that I've gone through. We can all attend webinars, go through these different training experiences, looking at FAR clauses, how to look at, the different rationale but really it's practical hands-on experience and partnering with colleagues that have expertise, identifying a mentor at your institution that negotiates federal contracts, being able to reach out to them and ask them the question, because that practical training is going to be much more effective, in my opinion, than some of this, theoretical knowledge that we learn through these webinars. Going through a contract, redlining a contract, engaging with a contracting officer, understanding how to communicate something is going to really help. And if you have a mentor who can guide you through that, it's going to be a much more enjoyable training process. Also reach out to other universities. If you run into a situation where there's a new FAR clause or something that you haven't experienced in the past, reach out to a university that may have experienced it. Again, there's universities out there that work with federal contractors more regularly than other universities. And so they may have seen it, previously and know how to manage a particular clause or a provision that's included in the contract. So, engaging and leveraging the knowledge of your peers at your institution and at other universities. Some of the benefits of working at a large university or a large university system is that you have these sister campuses that have similar policies and are subject to the similar state regulations. So you can reach out to them and see what they've done in a particular situation. Federal contracting is much easier when you have a reliable process. So something that can be replicated each time. Going back to export control and cybersecurity concerns with the federal acquisition regulations, if you have something that you can replicate that's easy to understand, you're going to be in a much better position. And then comprehensive resources, taking what's out there, what's publicly available, what's been shared in the chat, and developing a FAR resource for your institution is going to make federal contracting, again, much easier.
We've got a couple last comments, questions in the chat that I think we might have time for. Leanne noted that, as you mentioned, Jeff, having that support is definitely key. And Kelly has asked, are there any good training resources that you know of for institutions who lack personnel with experience in federal contracts?
I'm thinking back on what I found to be the best FAR training that I've gone through. Incura provided some FAR training a few years ago. I'm not positive as to whether it's still ongoing, but they had a speaker from an institution that worked in the federal contracting realm regularly. And it was a 2-day federal contracting training that was very detailed. It went through exercises in what to look for, how to read these FAR clauses, what you need to be doing as an institution to develop the tools for your contracting officers, what these different issues that you can come across are. It was 2 days, very intensive. So if Incura still offers that, I highly recommend it. It was very beneficial for me. Are there any other questions? Well, please feel free to reach out. This is a great introductory conversation, but FAR is very detailed. You can spend hours talking just about the clauses alone, let alone other processes, proposals, reading a solicitation, RFP. I mean, there's so many other things to consider when you're working with a federal agency and you're contracting with them. It really, you can spend a lot of time discussing it. So this is a very high level conversation, identifying a few key areas, few key issues to concern yourself with, developing partnerships with others at your university or at other universities. But feel free to reach out. Happy to discuss any other questions about federal contracting. What was the resource you said again you used in California? It was actually behind a firewall. It was specific to the institution, so it's not a publicly available platform. But it was great to have something that you could search. Not a matrix utilizing Excel obviously is still helpful, but you're scrolling through or you're searching Control F. So if you can develop a platform online that may be behind a firewall, if you want to protect that sort of information for your institution, I recommend using it. But there's a lot of publicly available resources out there. Incura. So I recommend Incura's FAR training if it's still being offered.
Okay, it looks like we're caught up on questions.
All right.
and we're nearing time. So thank you so much, Jeff, for leading that really great discussion on federal contracting. And thank you to all of you who joined us as well and who participated in the discussion. We hope you found the discussion enjoying and useful, and that you enjoy the rest of the FRAC conference.